Okay, I think the most important thing in tonight's session is to get as much discussion going as possible, and with the exception of Professor Brauch, you have heard some words today from each of the other panelists, and others have all been already introduced. If they think that anything is missing from the introductions that they have received, I'm sure they will take that opportunity as they answer questions. But I should say that Professor Brauch is Professor of International Relations at the Free University of Berlin and Chairman of Peace Research and European Security Studies. And this session, as Mark has said, is about peace building and reconciliation in a new world order, new actors, new challenges, and new opportunities. I think the main purpose of this session is, as you've been listening for most of the afternoon, with a few questions now and again, to get some discussion going between the audience and the full panel. And therefore, I would intend just to make a few brief comments and then open to the floor. So if anybody wants to ask the first question, start thinking about it now. I think when we think about new actors, new challenges, and new opportunities, we must surely be thinking in terms of new actors. I've heard discussion over the last 24 hours already about the role of China, not just in the global world order, but perhaps particularly in the developing world. We should also be thinking, as was pointed out by a number of speakers this afternoon, about the role of the African Union and the role of the regional and continental groupings of nations, no longer just the European Union. But I think the Professor mentioned this afternoon the Southeast Asian nations. We have representatives on the panel from South America, in addition to Europe. So we have a wide range of potential contributions on that front. We also have, in terms of new challenges, I think we see in this new world order, we see, for example, the new challenges provided by the economic position, but also new challenges, as mentioned by Professor Giddens, of multiculturalism in Europe, but also migration to and from the developing world, and the impact that that has both in the developing world and in the developed world. And in terms of new opportunities, perhaps also new threats, the whole relationship already touched on this afternoon between all elements of the Islamic world, not a homogeneous world in any sense, but that growing tension between some parts of the Islamic world and some parts of what we might call the West, but the new opportunities that might exist through changes in what was the old world order that was perhaps created specifically for the Cold War and a post-Second World War situation, but a new world order that is, I think, gradually being created, serious debates inside the United Nations, perhaps for the first time ever, but maybe moving towards reform, serious changes in the relationship that has gone from being the old G8, which I think is now time-limited, to the new G20, which I hope will become increasingly important. And new opportunities perhaps also provided on a positive note, and I think this was, again, highlighted by Professor Giddens, new opportunities that multiculturalism can bring. Yes, threats and challenges, but also perhaps in understanding and also in communication, new opportunities too. Maybe one word on that. I was I'll not be too specific. I was in the Middle East 18 months ago talking to ministers in one country there, in a country that's not run on democratic grounds, where they identified one of the key changes that was taking place as being the relationship between their young people and the rest of the world through mobile phones. It was shortly after the events in Gaza, and in January of 2009, and the impact that those events had within almost minutes of them taking place elsewhere in the region was largely due to the distribution of photographs and videos by mobile phone. But on the other side, those international communications that now exist perhaps give us new opportunities for greater understanding and for other other methods of communication that would lead to our world being a safer place rather than a place that's more volatile. And maybe that's one of the issues we might want to address if we're looking at cultural diplomacy. That sharing of cultures and sharing of communications around the world does definitely have an impact. But I don't intend to say any more than that, because I think you've heard a really wide-ranging series of contributions this afternoon, including the fascinating address by one of the great African leaders of our time this afternoon. And therefore, we've heard a bit about Africa, or from Africa, a bit from South America, a bit from the New Europe, and some of the best academic commentary that you're likely to hear anywhere from two distinguished writers, academics, speakers, and even that doesn't do either of them justice. So I would therefore open it up to you. Who would like to ask the first question to tonight's panel? And given that Professor Brauch has not had a chance to speak, he's the only one on the panel not spoken yet this afternoon, I'll come to him first for whatever the first question might be, if that's okay. Who would like to go first?
All right. Hello, and I guess everybody could answer this, but especially, do you think there's a solution to the conflict between the West and Iran? And I'm also taking the liberty to group Israel in the West category, or the other way around. And I mean, why does the West continue to support Israel? And now, and how does the West expect to win the trust of countries, Islamic states, especially Iran's leader Ahmadinejad and Khamenei, if they continue to support, actions that are so against the Islamic State? So, how do you expect to do it?
Well, that sounds like a good place to start with a question that's on the board tonight. And Professor, perhaps, as we've not heard from you today, would you like to?
Can I opt out on this question?
Of course you
can.
can.
I'm sorry,
I didn't mean to make it.
Well, we'll start over here.
I think it's a very, very crucial question. And I would like to start with one experience. I was mediating between the Danish government and 3 major Islamic clerics. And the mediation took place in Geneva, organized by the Arab Conflict Peace Human Rights Center. Tariq Ramadan was the other mediator. And I'll just bring you into it. It is wrongly called the Muhammad caricatures. That was not the issue. It was explained very clearly by the Muslim clerics that since the birth of the Prophet in 598, which is when the Muslim way of reckoning starts, Islam has never been understood by the West. It's always been insulted. But there was one thing they were not prepared to accept, and that was the Danish Prime Minister's complete refusal to dialogue. First with the 200,000 Danish Muslims, then with the 11 ambassadors to Copenhagen from Arab countries, and the drop that became too much, the straw for the camel's back to have a slightly desert-like simile, was when the Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Conference asked for dialogue. And the Danish Prime Minister said, what is that conference? Well, it's 1,560 million Muslims. There are 5.3 million Danes, for your information. That guy later on qualified as Secretary General of NATO because of his ignorance is, of course, a part of it. So I guess that was the qualifying test for that particular multilateral group to appoint a Secretary General. But the point now is the following. We had a mediation session, and it became very clear from the beginning that the same newspaper that had published the cartoons, the caricatures, had an editor who 3 years before had been approached by a Danish cartoonist who wanted to make cartoons about Jesus Christ ascending to heaven. And that was always for me a mystery when I went to school. How did he do it? I mean, it's not that easy. So there were cartoons about that. And that cartoonist got the answer this will offend our Christian readers, so we are not going to publish it. Well, when the 3 Danish government delegates became aware that the Muslims knew this, they knew the game was lost. So at this point, I made 2 proposals. One was accepted and one was rejected. And it's the one that was rejected that I'm interested in. The one that was accepted was, this is a Friday, Monday morning the Danish government invites immediately for dialogues, youth with youth, clerics with clerics, politicians with politicians, lawyers with lawyers, whatever kind of that. You just invite it. And the other side cancels the burning of embassies and the burning of Danish flags. And that's exactly what happened. It happened the same Monday, and since it was centrally organized, it was easy to cancel it. It had actually started not because of the Muslims in Denmark, but when the Secretary General of OIC, when it became known that he was not considered a dialogue partner. But the second point is, to me, a kind of opening, and I would like to invite the audience to try to find a way in which it could be realized. My proposal was very simple. Let's have an international conference to try to explore the gray zone between freedom of expression and freedom not to be insulted, injured, hurt. As a matter of fact, it is better in German, Ausdrucksfreiheit und Kränkungsfreiheit. We have it in domestic law. The Jews are protected. Christians, to some extent, are protected, but the Muslims not. So how do you define that which is so sacred that you should not make fun of it? How do you do that? It's the West's inability to do this that seems to me utterly repugnant. And let me add to that one word. It has fallen to me quite often around the world to organize roundtables. And usually, since I am a kind of Buddhist with pagan spots, or pagan with Buddhist spots, depends on how you see it, some sort of Dalmatian dog, I usually have then some Christians to one side and Muslims to the other, and I ask them, what is the thing you're most afraid of on the other side? And the Christians say immediately jihad, which they haven't even cared to understand what is. It does not mean holy war. That's the 4th stage of jihad, which is a much more complex concept. And the Muslims say holy war, and they have a feeling that the Christians find it particularly holy when it is against Muslims. Then I asked them, what's the best thing you have found in the others? And the Muslims said, quite often, that there are Christianities and Christianities and Christianities. Back home where I come from, there's only one Islam. Now, on a global scale, that's not quite true. But back home where I come from, it might be true. Then I asked the Christians, what is the best thing you have to say about Islam? Total silence. Now, this silence is not because they haven't found anything, because they don't know any single thing about Islam, except what I misunderstood. So I'm just throwing that back to you. Let us start with a very simple education, 10 simple points about Islam, or something like that. And you have, I would assume, actually, a fertile ground, because people are actually curious. So that is the kind of lead a group like this should take.
Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, I can speak without a mic. I'd like to comment on the issue of Iran because it's so important. I mean, my analysis is this. We live in a world where we've created dangers for ourselves far more enveloping than any other previous civilization has done. And the 2 greatest dangers to me are proliferation of nuclear weapons and climate change, because both of those could destroy hundreds of millions of people, at least in the worst case scenarios they could. So I think what happens in Iran is an absolute frontline issue for world society. I don't think it's much to do with the West versus Islam at all. It's a matter of power politics. It's a matter of Iran wanting to be a major regional player. It's a matter of Iran pointing to hypocrisies in the existing nuclear states where they say we can have nuclear weapons, but you can't have nuclear weapons. But I feel it's a frontline issue, and therefore, even though there is this hypocrisy, I think I'm not in favor of any military action against Iran, but I think the world has to bend every possible opportunity it can to contain the chance of Iran getting effective nuclear weapons with delivery missile systems. We know it's got delivery missile systems. I think there could be a new bout of proliferation of weaponry, a new arms race in the Middle East as a result of that. Could be new dangers of the loss of fissile materials. It's an absolutely frontline issue with no simple solution at all. So I feel, I'm not sure that sanctions will work, and we're really up against it in the case of Iran, I think. But the interest of the world is that Iran should not get effective nuclear weapons. And the hypocrisy argument counts, I think, for very little against the fact that the world would become much, much more dangerous because it could be the start of many other nations acquiring them. And then, as a world, we're in real trouble.
Thank you for that.
Let me come in now, as you have given me one catchword.
Something you can fight against.
Not really. I pick it up. Now, I think if we look at this conflict, we see that both have a perspective of security that is very much related with the state and the military instrument. But if you look at that region, and if you look ahead for the next 20 to 50 years, you will see that both will be hit tremendously by the second major challenge Lord Giddens just referred to, by climate change. But I think these issues are just not being perceived. They are not on the agenda, hardly on the agenda in Israel. On the water issues, since 2002, climate change was, then they started to take climate change into their consideration on water issues. But I think this will be the challenge. So what my argument is, we need a transformation of the thinking on security, looking at the longer term challenge, picking up your joke, on climate change, on the two planets talking to each other.
I meant it as a joke. It's not a joke, really.
No, if we look at the new challenge by 2050, what the governments are committed, the governments at the G7 or G8 are committed to reduce emissions globally by 50% in the next 40 years. And that means for the OECD countries, minus 80%. Now, what if we see what is being done, what has been done in Copenhagen, what will be done in Cancun? Hardly anything. It's postponed. So I think we see a fundamental change. If we don't act now, the price will be tremendous. And I think if we see this from a wider, completely different angle of security, where the human being is in the center, and if we ask, what is the challenge? Then it's us is the challenge, our economic behavior, our use of energy. And if you think that through much longer, you cannot fight a war against yourself. If you think that through with regard to the solutions we need totally different solutions. We need totally different instruments. And I think there are quite a few scientists, natural scientists, physicists, who have said we are entering the need for a new Copernican revolution in thinking, a new fundamental paradigm shift towards sustainable development. Now, if we think this through, and the actors, who will be the victims, the young people in this room, they will live through. You will see whether that what we are talking about today is relevant or is affecting your future. So if we think on this, so I think we have to turn the discussion on what are the solutions. And the solutions are not the military. The military cannot solve that challenge. So knowledge, I think, is a key instrument. The knowledge and the rethinking. And this also requires a change in the mindset, in the worldviews of policymakers, but also of academic institutions, to give those challenge a much higher visibility within the academic system. So again, I was very much inspired also by your book on the politics of climate change.
Well, thank you.
As we've moved on to climate change, I'm not on to, but we've driven climate change into the centre of this agenda. Perhaps the President may have a contribution to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the next question will be, how are we going to change our thinking? How are we going to do that? And from where? I think that the place where we're standing now is a wall that which dialogue is very hegemonic. And from that hegemony, from there, we're making every principle, everything is coming from that perspective. Peace is coming from that hegemonic perspective. Culture is coming from that perspective. And education is coming from there. When we're talking about peace building, if we're still talking from that hegemonic power, then we're going to be exactly the same. I think that while if we remained in the same place, we cannot have new actors. We may have new challenge, but we will have exactly the same actor. You cannot have new actors in the old play, in the old plot. You need new actor, and that new actor will need new perspective, which is new paradigm. And that new paradigm to construct that building and that new world, those paradigm has to start exactly in education. And that is the problem. While I was listening to you, I felt, I have to confess, frankly, a little bit out of base, as the baseballists used to say, or offside, as the football player, the soccer player used to say. Because apparently, when we talk about culture, America doesn't exist. Nobody cares about the culture of Pachacutic or about the culture of Chiapas. That doesn't exist in the world. And you're right, it doesn't exist. They are not actors. Because even them are being judged according with the old principles from that hegemonic dialogue. So they don't exist. They may play. They have made revolutions in Mexico, in Ecuador. Pachacutic has come out and make news, but nothing else, because they are not new actors. They are acting in the same plot. So nothing is new. We have to change paradigm. How we're going to change that, I do not know. What I can tell you is this. Education, which will be our main tool, has not been used. Let me tell you about some very fast figures. What the world invests in education, in new science, in new knowledge, is 100%. From that, 38% is United States and Canada. 28% is Europe. 14% is Japan. And the rest is the rest of the world. From Latin America, it's about 1.6% of what the world invests in new knowledge, which is about 0.6 of the budget of the world of Latin America, and we're 400 million people over there. So we have nothing to do in the new world. We are not participating in this perspective. Nevertheless, that education that we need has been very, very, very short. What the world spent in armament is $1.5 trillion. What is the budget of the United Nations? You know how much? 29 billion. What is the budget of the World Health Organization? It's 15 billion. It's a minimal fraction of what the world invests in weapons. Minimal fraction. So what we need is new paradigms, and we have to start from there. From there. We need now a total disarmament. That is our duty. That is the duty in meetings to say in meetings like this. Total disarmament. In that moment, it will be impossible to kill anyone because there is no weapons. And besides that, you have 1.5 trillion to invest in drugs, in medicines. You don't have to patent it anymore. It says that the World Health Organization has a lot of a very good job. Yes, that very good job came from non-patented medicines. Penicillin was not patented, sulfa was not patented, streptomycin was not patented, polio vaccine was not patented. Madame Curie never said that the radium will be patented. But if the transnational says that they need money to innovation in medicine, okay, let's take the money from the innovation. That is the new paradigms that we need. Thank you.
Dr. Zuzul?
Thank you. I found interesting two proposals or statements that were made. And on one, I think that it is rather easy to agree, and that is that we need new paradigm, new framework. And that is, I think, the most visible in the Middle East, because existing framework for the solution simply doesn't bring us any closer to the solution. It brings us in more and more dangerous situation. However, the proposal that new paradigm can be the common threat that we are all facing in the future with the global changing, I'm afraid that will not work. First of all, if you go in the Middle East, and if you ask people in Israel, what is the biggest threat for them? They will immediately answer to you, the biggest threat is Iran and possibility for Iran to have nuclear weapon. And by the way, without desire to judge, they are not only those who are scared of that, they are the others. However, if you go to Iran, they will say that for them, the biggest threat is the state of Israel. You will not get them to think about what can happen 50 years from now when they are afraid that they can somehow face their biggest threat for their destiny 5 years from now. And the other thing that I'm certainly not underestimating, quite in contrary, the problem of climate changes, however we formulate it. My experience in talking with people in different parts of the world is this. In many undeveloped or developing countries, or countries of new democracies, they don't perceive that as a threat because they have things that are much more dangerous from their daily perspective than what can happen 50 years from now. And then even among those who are aware of that, there is a kind of position, yes, but Western world brought us into this, so it is not fair that we share equal responsibility. We want to develop at the same level, and then we will be equally responsible. Regardless if that is true or not, that is the way how they very often perceive it.
Thank you very much. Now, that I think was occasionally getting quite interesting. So are there other questions on these topics? Before we move on to new topics, let's just stick with the topic, the very important topic that was raised and the responses. Maybe take one or two questions on that, come back to the panel, and then we can move on to a new topic. I think that would make sense.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm from Canada. And I'm just I want to ask something about Israel to just get a bit more specific because you guys started to talk about that. I'm sorry, I'm very nervous.
Yeah.
There was a presentation this morning about genocide and how to avoid genocide. And I couldn't help noticing that all of the criteria for defining genocide actually applied to the Palestinian question and how the Israelis are treating Palestinians today. In other words, I couldn't help notice that just using that definition, that Israel is waging a genocide against Palestinians. Now, if we talk about Israel and talk about genocide, that's like a taboo, because everyone or many people would accuse me of being anti-Semitic, which is actually completely not the case. But it seems that Europe, and especially Europe, I'm talking about the Western world, they're very afraid to criticize Israel, and they're very afraid to actually side with the Palestinians. And in the process, the Palestinians have become dehumanized. We don't see them anymore as humans. We see them as something below humans, because we have this fear, at least that's how it started, of criticizing Israel because we are accused of being anti-Semitic because the Holocaust took place in Europe or in the Western world. So I'm just very disappointed in the Western stance, in siding with Israel and just letting what's happening in Palestine continue to take place for the last 60 years or so.
Okay. Thank you very much for that contribution. Is there maybe one more question on this same topic, or will I move back to the panel and then come back for the next topic? Okay. Can we move back to the good doctor?
I just wanted to add one thing about Iran. It's a very short thing, and it is a solution. My own experience talking with Iranian politicians is that when this issue is brought up, they bring up 4 very concrete numbers. 1953, 1953, toppling a legally elected prime minister by CIA and MI6. Now, if that could be not only admitted, but if US, UK could come out clearly and say, we wish we hadn't done that. We had some reasons, they were the following, but we wish we hadn't done it. Then that would mobilize, for those who know the Quran, Surah 861. When your antagonist inclines towards peace, you shall do the same. Extremely important. When I talk about with people in Washington, State Department, Pentagon about this, it's the nuclear issue that comes up all the time, which I think Iran likes very much that people in the West shall believe that they are developing nuclear weapons. I think they love it. They have an absolutely, you could say, almost paranoid, psychopathological idea. We are not going to be screwed again by the West. 1953 was enough. That brought us 25 years of Shah dictatorship. What comes after that is no apology for the Shah dictatorship. We want an apology, unconditional. Is the West able to do that? And I could say to Tony, when are you going to advocate scrapping the Trident?
Do either of you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I mean, I think what was said about Israel wasn't wholly accurate, because I think the European Union has adopted a much more nuanced view of Palestinian issue than the United States. So I think it's not wholly true that Western countries have just taken an anti-Palestinian position, actually. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. But I really like this stuff about we need a revolution, because this is how it is, it seems to me. I mean, it seems to me that we're on the edge of, we have to create a new society, a new economy in the world, really. We have to do so because of the issue of climate change, but because of other issues which we confront. And we have to find the way to do it. So, I had this idea of what I call I want to see a certain return to utopian thinking. It's gone out of fashion. But I want to temper that with realism. So I talk about having an element of utopian realism in politics. And if you look at the issue of climate change, I think you can see that happening because, for example, masses of interesting things going on about, let's say, the future of the car. The car is a gas guzzler, but I mean, cars have subverted their own existence. No longer, when you have a 100-mile traffic jam from Beijing to Tibet, a car is certainly not an instrument of freedom and mobility, is it? The MIT study on the future of the automobile, really, really interesting. It says what you could have a much more, like they call it a mobile internet, in which you could actually minimize traffic accidents. Lots of cars would be driverless. You'd break down the division between private and public transport. It is kind of utopian, but it's not wholly utopian, because many of the technologies already exist. What we're looking at is transformation of cities, transformation of buildings. You build more resilience into buildings by insulating them more. You also help reduce carbon emissions from those buildings. I think there is a kind of ferment of inventiveness going on around the world, which is going to be very, very important, certainly in containing climate change, more important than, for example, international negotiations in Cancun. So I think we are on the edge of creating quite a different civilization. I think we're at the end of the industrial period, really, and we're talking of 20 or 30 years of creating a new kind of global socio-economic order. I think the Chinese leadership recognizes this, and to a less extent the Indian leadership, because you cannot recapitulate Western experience of industrialization with 1.4 billion people and expect the outcome will be a happy one. You cannot. So therefore, I think Chinese leadership is acutely aware of the need to have a new developmental model. As far as possible for me, that should be inspired by genuine ethics of welfare, not just by GDP accumulation. And I think this has to be true of the industrial countries too, because you could say austerity is a kind of wake-up call really to a world living beyond its means in a kind of frenetic commercialism, which actually does not improve people's levels of happiness and satisfaction. So we need a lot of radical thinking, I think, here. I think it goes a long way beyond education for me, because you're talking about a low-carbon economy would not just be an economy with a lot of electric cars in it. It will be a very different kind of economic system linked to a very different kind of economic system. If we can find a positive gloss on this, you can use the problems, I think Jacques was indicating, as a positive. You know, you can have a positive vision of what a low-carbon economy would be like. You can have a positive vision of what a different kind of socio-economic order could be like. You could have a positive vision on the level of armaments too, because in the UK, we've suddenly come up against the fact that we're a country that can no longer do what we used to do with warfare. And I mean, you have Costa Rica in Latin America that has no army. I mean, the UK is not going to be a society that doesn't have an army, but nevertheless, you can see that our original ambitions, I think, are kind of post-imperial languor of some sort, that we cannot have the same kind of military presence. So, you know, I'd like to see what I call utopian realism applied in all these spheres.
If you can't think of a question on that, then you're not thinking very much. Very wide-ranging, but inspirational stuff.
Yeah.
Professor?
Okay. I would like to pick up on both questions. So my thesis is that the elites, both in Israel, Iran, but also in Palestine, they are to some extent, or to a large extent, the victims of their own mindset in how they conceptualize the challenges they are facing. And so I try to invite you now to a thought experiment and linking it with an argument I made this morning. And I presented this for the first time at the Second Israeli-Palestinian Conference 6 years ago in Antalya. So how can there be lessons drawn from Europe? And from the 60 years of peace in Europe. So, and I played with
apart from ex-Yugoslavia.
Yeah, no, I played with a few key leaders, and I just want to take one out of the pocket. So the Marshall Plan was a conditionalized aid with a goal to integrate Germany, which was not popular in the UK and in France and many other countries. So can't we conceive what are the challenges Israel, Palestine, and maybe to a lesser extent Iran are facing? If we project the population development and the resource issues for Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, population is projected to grow tremendously. The water supply will drop tremendously. And due to the increase in temperature, the water you need for food production will drop also tremendously. So if you project this into the future, is you have a not only water scarcity, you have the most severe water problem in the future, which Israel probably can solve with desalination, but it's very difficult for Palestine, it's very difficult for Jordan. And so
Also
is there a
very
way
carbon
out?
intensive, very
Yeah, yeah.
carbon intensive. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, is there a way out? Can we foresee in the peace building project the ideas of conditionalized aid by the European Union to be used? And I played with the Gulf of Aqaba, where 3 countries are close together. Can we foresee there a multilateral project, not on coal and steel, but on the technologies of the future that may help us to solve the challenges? Can't we foresee to have a kind of system where you have the component in the 3 countries, in Egypt, Israel, and Jordan, that will only function if there's cooperation. If there's no cooperation, it doesn't function. So maybe to have this solar energy component in one country, maybe in Jordan, to have the desalination in the other country, and have a food experiment maybe in Israel, in Eilat. And so, and to have an institution where the condition of the sponsors is that Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, and Egyptians have to work together on addressing the challenges to their survival for the next 40 years. Now, I've seen public opinion polls from both Israel and Palestine that the people at large from both communities, they would be very much willing a cooperation on solving issues of health, issues of water, and so on. So this has never been used, but why is it important? So my argument is the mindset has to be changed. The ideas have to be overcome, that the other is the threat. And the idea gradually has to trickle down that we are the threat, but we are the solution, but only by cooperation, not by fighting each other. Now this is probably, for that region, I presented it there. There was not too much debate, but a lot of private debate afterwards. But I've never seen similar, let's say, ideas that address the solutions of the future with and link it with conditionalized aid, that the benefit is only with cooperation and there's no benefit if one opts out.
Sounds like utopian realism in practice.
Okay, can we, that's been a good airing, I think, on that front. Maybe a question on a slightly different topic, perhaps. Person at the back here with a pencil in the air.
I guess I'm lucky. Thank you. Since Winston Churchill's ideas were touched a couple of times during the previous lecture, I would like to connect my question with another concept of Winston Churchill, meaning United States of Europe. Do you think it's ever possible to create a common European identity, bearing in mind Euroscepticism for Great Britain, for instance, and if so, if there is a necessity for such a common identity in the European Union? Thank you.
In the context of the Europe's relationship with North America and the United States in particular? Yeah?
No, just a common European identity, because right now it's quite difficult to say that people position themselves first as Europeans. First, they're either English or French, or only in the second position they consider themselves Europeans. And my question is whether it's possible to create a common European identity, and if there is a necessity for this. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions on the European Union and Europe in that sort of context? We'll take them at the same time. No? Well, can I suggest we go to someone who led the campaign to join the European Union, so may have some views on this.
Thank you. I really think that we had, but indeed, brilliant lecture before that was answering to that question, a lecture about relations between multiculturalism and nation state and nation idea, that it is very much present in Europe, and let's be frank, it will remain present. Not only in United Kingdom, but all over the Europe. But saying that, I am not a pessimist about Europe. So if you, it depends always how you use the term identity. Certainly there is even now certain level of European identity, but not And I don't personally believe that it will be ever so strong to replace Italian identity, Spanish identity, Portuguese, German, or French. And frankly speaking, I don't think that that will be good. That's my personal opinion, because there are many different facets, many different levels of identity, cultural identities, historical identity, not only political. When it comes to political solution, in responding to this title, I think that European Union, in a way, is a new actor, which maybe give us example how things can change. Maybe very much on the line that that you mentioned a minute ago. I don't know if that will work exactly that way in the Middle East, because there are so many differences in European Union. But I would just to remind you that Schuman declarations, although it is typically call and still is speaking about reconciliation. So that was plain how to reach reconciliation between, primarily between France and Germany, because without reconciliation, even Schuman in that time, he knew that the project will not work. And then didn't remain only in a space, because again, we can easily agree, oh yes, of course, reconciliation is needed everywhere. But this was, if you ask me, as far as I know, the only concrete agenda in the history that was based on reconciliation, starting from Schuman Plan, adding a Marshall Plan to that, which was supported by financing, but based on the agenda. And although maybe not everyone will agree, I also think foundation of NATO. So when we add to the idea several very concrete things that could help to the development of idea, I think that helped to bring us to the level that Europe or European Union, or generally Europe is right now, and I think that everyone, despite of the problems, should be happy with the historical moment of Europe. Can we learn and can we apply that somewhere else? I'm not so optimistic, not entirely pessimistic, but not quite certain that it can work exactly the same way.
Can I maybe butt in with an opinion here rather than just moderate? I think one of the biggest mistakes that those who believe in the European Union make, and I would count myself as a real believer in the importance of the European Union, is to try and impose a European identity almost over the heads of the individual peoples of either nations or regions in Europe. I don't think the fact that Bavaria is now comfortably a part of Germany, and Bavarians would call themselves Germans, but only in addition to being Bavarians, to be Bavarians first and foremost, makes the German state any less unified and any less effective. And similarly, I hope in due course that in the UK, the fact that Scots now have their own political identity through a parliament doesn't make us any less part of the UK, in my view. But I think any attempt to impose Britishness on Scottish people was always doomed to fail. The same is true in Catalonia, in Spain, probably in Sicily, certainly true in Flanders, and true elsewhere. So, I mean, I believe very strongly that you have to, if you're looking at cultural, national, historical identity of that sort, you have to accept where people are, and you can't force them or persuade them to change that identity. Identity has so many roots, and it is perfectly possible to create a functioning, successful, effective European Union without imposing a European identity on people to the detriment of their instinctive identities that they have always had. I think the biggest problem with the European Union is the decisions it makes. It's not whether or not people feel European. Most people in Europe feel European in addition to their national identity, but they don't necessarily agree with the remote bureaucracy making decisions that sometimes seems way out of touch. I think that's the problem. That's just my opinion.
Someone wants to comment now.
Yes, can we take a few from the floor and then come back to the panel again?
Just exactly to what you said, actually, about European identity. Oh, sorry. No, just exactly to what you said about being European, but actually being not European. What do you think about the problem Macedonia has with Greece?
The problem that
The Macedonia and Greece.
Macedonia and Greece.
Exactly. Just exactly to what you said. Could you repeat it exactly to Macedonia and Greece, maybe?
Yeah.
Ticklish issue, we think.
I think just by making the question, you make the point very, very effectively. And perhaps the panel could just remember that as we come back to them. Let me take 2 or 3 other questions and then come back to the panel.
Comment on what you just said.
A comment can be a question. That's
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Dominic, I come from Austria, and I'm a graduate of the College of Europe. So you can imagine that I studied in much detail European policies, and the question of EU-European identity comes along quite often. So I have a question. Do you really think that the European Union tries to impose a European identity? Because I think, and what I think that everybody should think about, that it is unity in diversity, what I really believe in, and that every national identity has its place, and that it's not really imposing European identity, but trying to make people identify with the European project, which is not the same. And I think that's what the European Union might be short of right now, that people are in for the project and try to identify with it. Thank you.
I think that's a very, very good point. Any other points on this whole area, or perhaps on Greece, Macedonia, and that general part of the world? Here?
Well, coming back to the threat of the others and the new way of thinking, how does that work, and how can we achieve reconciliation and this new way of thinking if the threat of the others by leading politicians, as in the US by the Tea Party movement, or in Germany by Mr. Sarrazin, or the Bavarian Minister President Seehofer, or in France, Mr. Sarkozy, by sending away the Romas, is always fired again, so to say. I mean, that the normal people think, hey, there must be something wrong with the others.
Okay, I'll take a couple of other points and then come back to the panel. Someone here?
Hi, I'm Julia, a history student in Heidelberg, Germany. Just a question also regarding identity, but more on a personal level. Do you think that identity is increasingly more connected to religion? And if so, do you perceive that as a threat or potential danger?
I think we could spend the whole night on that one. That's a good question. Over here? Anybody over here?
Hi, I'm Emesha from Hungary, but I study in Maastricht. I study European studies. And I had a whole course about the idea of Europe and the identity of Europe. We talked about the negative identification, as Huntington and Landes mentioned, that Europe needs the others, needs the East, needs the Orient to identify ourselves. Do you think it's still really important to need the others, need the East, need somebody negative to us to identify Europe or European Union? Thank you.
Okay, I think these questions are related actually in some way, so I think that's been a good group of questions to take back to the panel. I'll go around the panel and then come back, and maybe the next group of questions could be on, for want of a better description, the Global South and perhaps the international institutions, something along those lines. So we've had Europe and we've had the tensions in the Middle and Near East, but let's maybe move on in the next group of questions to either the Global South or the international institutions, or both, and how they relate to each other. Let me start with, on Europe, let me start with Professor Giddens on these issues of identity.
Well, I mean, on the issue of Europe, I'm a committed pro-European. I remain a believer in the European project. I think at the moment it's under severe tension and strain, but quite often tensions and strains produce new creative opportunities. This is happening certainly in terms of economic governance in the European Union at the moment. I think there's a positive outcome from that. So I haven't lost at all hope that the European Union will be a significant actor in the wider world. And I agree with what Jack said on it in relation to your question, one or two other questions, that less important than the identity of Europe as such is whether Europe can have a common projects and whether those projects can count for something in the wider world. And At the moment, I think, you know, Europe suffers from a serious leadership deficiency, and I just cannot understand why the Lisbon Treaty was so screwed up in this ridiculous way that, I don't know if this is on the record or not, but because one of the people involved I know quite well, but I mean, you know, you go through all this paraphernalia, you have referenda in different countries, parliaments discuss it, you get a new chair of the European Council, you get a new foreign representative, and what do? You appoint people who no one has ever heard of, with the obvious implication that the national leaders still want to retain their power within the system. You thereby subvert the very thing you set it up for. So, you know, I think that's a serious loss of possibility for Europe. But in the medium and long term, I'm strongly committed to the European project, not just as, I mean, I think it will evolve and change, not just as a project of discovering a common identity, though, but rather as becoming a significant geopolitical actor with, I hope, a humanitarian consequences for world society. I haven't lost that dream myself that it can be that, but at the moment it's quite a long way from really exerting the power that it should have, and we all know the problems in that area. I think this issue of, you know, can you have an identity without it being opposed to another is a pretty important one. And there's a point beyond which you can't, I think, because you take the identity of being a woman, you know, it's something you can work on, you can produce, but hard to say that it isn't in some sense related to the fact that men exist and that sexual difference is a sort of guiding theme. I mean, look at me sitting here, you know, with a tie and a suit on. That's a sort of definition of masculinity, and, you know, these things are defined to some extent oppositionally, but I don't think the opposition, you know, in relation to the questions asked, has to be the other as an alien force. I mean, in the case of men and women, no doubt still is, but, you know, it doesn't have to be like an alien force. So I think when you see the other as a looming threat, I don't think that is necessary for defining one's own identity, and I think defining your own identity through difference is exactly what I meant by cosmopolitanism, really.
Having started the day without a tie and a suit on, and then having put one on because I felt out of place, I'll maybe move on at this stage. Doctor?
I find that very, very good things have been said, and I will just go one step further. I actually hope there will be no European identity. It's the multi-state cooperation that counts, the web of mutual and relatively equal benefit. That's what counts. When I look back at European history, let me just remind you, at a time when there was a European identity, I'm thinking of 27 November 1095 in the afternoon, when the Crusades were launched. Well, it was Western Christianity. They killed a lot of Jews and Serbs, Orthodox, on the way, and did massive killing of Muslims, including eating boiled children. It was very, very ugly, extremely ugly. And there is much of that in Europe, and if I go to the European Union, the genius of Schuman and Monnet, I do not find in their speeches the word reconciliation. I find another word, because I find the word family. Nazi Germany has been so atrocious that it has to become a member of the family. Extremely audacious, brilliant. Simply an overarching concept, which started then in May 1950, of course, with the Coal and Steel Union, and later on became, as of 1st of January 58, the European Community, and so on, which I think has model character, as Brauch was pointing out. It has model character for the others. Very, very important. But I would like to make a distinction between the European Council and the European Commission. In my experience, the most likely successor to the US empire is certainly not China. They're not interested in that, not because they're pacifist, but because they think all of us are barbarians. Who the devil should care about these barbarians? Well, some barbarians are more charming than others. For your information, we are divided in 4 countries: North, East, South, and West barbarians. I myself am a West barbarian, married to a Japanese East barbarian. and when we come, we are very, very often in Beijing, we introduce ourselves as West-East barbarian marriage. Now, they have plenty of sense of humor, so I can get away with most things I say when I start talking about Tibet and things of that type. But the point that I'm going to make, be aware of the Council of Ministers. That's where the uniformed people meet. That's where the idea of coming into the shoes of the falling US empire is quite popular. Just as the US once went into the shoes of the falling Spanish Empire, 1898 onwards. European Commission has a much more civilian approach, much more interest in conflict resolution. And that, to my mind, is the paradigm we are searching for, the overarching conflict resolution. I have only one point about desalination. It is not energy intensive. Today it is made by parabolic mirrors. It's very inexpensive.
Yes, true.
And the best place to have it would be at the border between Israel and Gaza and the border between Israel and Lebanon. Gaza, Egypt would also be interesting. Parabolic mirrors is the key to it.
The key new actor in all of this is the guy who runs the desalination plant. We'll go here.
Now, let me answer briefly on the question of identity. I raised this in a seminar 15 years ago in Leipzig, in Saxonia. And I asked the students what their identity is. I got one answer, which I never forget. A student said, well, my first identity is Saxonian. And I said, what's the second? It's European. With Germany, I have my problems. So let me get back to the challenges and the European Union as actor. If what the politicians decided on for the goal for 1950, if they believe it in, and if this goal is real, it requires a total decarbonization of the economy, a total transformation of the economy. It requires not only a paradigm shift towards sustainability, it also probably requires a fourth sustainable green revolution in the future. Now, where could the European Union take the lead? At present, it's unlikely, after the election outcome, that the US will take the lead on this issue.
More than unlikely,
Obama has already indicated that he will make compromises with the Republican Party on this issue. So if this analysis is not just declaratory politics of the G7, why is the European Union, we have the 2020 agreement for 2020, says now we are ready to go to 30% reduction, and we use our capabilities to make the European continent the leader, probably in cooperation with China and other countries who are investing a lot right now. China has doubled or quadrupled their expenditures on renewables and so on. So to become the leader in the transformation, and in doing that transformation, linking also the thinking on peace building. So I think what we need in the future, what I call for the Anthropocene era, is a new policy of peace for the Anthropocene that tries to combine the economic transformation towards sustainability goals and structures and processes with a leadership role of the European Union in promoting this with the goal to undercut future conflicts that may occur due to water scarcity, due to food scarcity, and so on. So to have a proactive approach, I have not seen the President of the European Union, I have not seen the spokesman on foreign security policy, I have not seen leading representatives of the European Commission to take the lead very outspokenly. And I could foresee this would be an approach that is not threatening in military terms anybody. It would be an approach that shows our abilities and that links the resources of the European Union, also of the 7th Framework Programme, to a very concrete political goal towards a transition strategy towards sustainability. I think there the European Union, if they would be able to take such a lead, I could foresee that they would create a lot of identity for the young generation. Many of them may think in similar lines. But so far, the process has been highly technocratic and bureaucratic, and there are very few overarching goals that have been addressed by European leaders.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Dr. Zuzul on this subject, can I just make one point, and that is, it seems to me that one of the most dramatic changes in the role of the European Union in the world in the last decade has been the fact that there was only really an agreement in Kyoto, insufficient as it was, because of the role of the European Union, who very much provided the political leadership for the discussions that took place in Kyoto and that then led to the agreement that was made. And in Copenhagen last year, despite the fact that the meetings were taking place inside the European Union rather than thousands of miles away, the European Union were not even in the room when the final agreement was made between President Obama and 4 or 5 other nations. And I think that shift in the power and influence and the proactivity of the European Union on the environment is perhaps a very good example of how things have perhaps, influence has certainly been lost over these last 10 years, and the European Union has got to look at how it deals with these sorts of interventions.
Although, as I said earlier, I do believe that the project of European Union is a really successful project despite of all the difficulties and the problems. And I see really the one of the reasons for difficulties is in architecture of European Union, even after Lisbon Treaty, as it was mentioned earlier, that namely, or primarily, that division between Commission and the Council. Commission is, at least in intention, trying to behave like government. In reality, they are behaving like a bureaucratical part of European Union. However, they don't have political power, because political power is in the Council. Council is consisting of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who are referring to their respectful government. And those respectful government cannot agree on a number of the issues. Let's take Middle East, for example. I mean, you cannot have one European unique position when different member states have different positions. Kyoto is indeed a positive example, because on that all respectful government had the same position. And just briefly, not to leave it unanswered, the answer about Macedonia and Greece, but let me also use that as an example. You know, the world that we live was never organized on rational principles. It is not now, and we don't know if ever it will be organized on rational principles. It is organized on many different principles: emotional, social, historical, and so on. And the way how we see the things, it's not necessarily the way how people that are affected see things. For example, for me, I have friends on both sides, and in a way we were in a similar situation. We were trying to help in a way to come to the solution. Because for us, looking from outside, even those of us who are so close, like we from Croatia, former Yugoslavia, that issue of the name looks rather marginal in all other issues that two countries in neighborhood should have and do have together. However, when you ask them, it is not marginal. If you ask Macedonians, they will tell you, ordinary people or intellectuals, not only politicians, they will tell you, oh, we can never give up on a name, because that is the most important part of our identity. Without our name, we wouldn't have identity. If you ask people in Greece, they will tell you it's not about identity, it's about the territory. By picking up the name of Macedonia, they are expressing their interest to have all territory of what was historically or geographically Macedonia. Again, looking from outside, does anyone really think that Macedonia is going to commit an act of aggression to take the territory? Probably not. But those rather small symbolical issues becomes very important political things. And when you have domestic politicians that in a theory are there to lead the nation into direction of the solution, but in reality they have to respond to those who are voting for them, are expecting from them, you finish in some kind of closed circle.
Thank you very much. Now, let's stick to this idea of moving outside Europe, if we can, with a final couple of questions, because I'm conscious that we have, we're kind of ignoring the President on the right-hand side here, and I want to get his contribution to some of these big global issues. And you have been waiting for an hour, so you're getting to go first.
Hi, my name is Tove Holmström. I'm an Indigenous Studies major, and I've just recently spent 18 months working with Aboriginal people in Australia. So in the context of reconciliation, I would like for you to talk a bit about Indigenous people, especially, I guess, the notion of collective guilt, historical justice, and perhaps governments using apologies to Indigenous people to sort of gain votes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting point. Can we get another couple of points here? One here.
Thanks. I'm really interested in ideas of international involvement in reconciliation. And I'm wondering if perhaps you can touch on whether there's a limit to how much international actors can become involved in reconciliation, and potentially keeping in mind some of the things we heard today, where some of the nations that are leading this involvement have their own domestic issues of reconciliation and societal change to address.
Okay. Indigenous people, reconciliation, international interventions at the front here. Peter.
I'm Felix Olatunji from Nigeria. I've been talking about global justice all these days, but when we look at it from the perspective of Africans, it is difficult today. Now, you look at Nigeria, for instance, there is Niger Delta conflict on daily basis, uprising. We have Boko Haram in the north on daily basis. Is it because there is a failure of the government in Nigeria in itself, or individuals? We are thinking of nationalities in the sense of ethnicities now. Now, I see myself as first a Yoruba man than being a Nigerian, because I can see that the government of Nigeria has not done anything to develop the whole country. Now, what people do is they now align with their own group as against the federal government. Now, we should know that without peace, we cannot talk of development. And without reconciliation, peace will be difficult. How do you see this in the sense of Africans?
Okay, it's all very wide-ranging. One more, Peter, just behind you. This, here, right there. That's it, yep.
I'm Azumi. I'm from Japan, but not living there at the moment. For me, like this kind of topic, like peace and reconciliation, like as Japanese, North Korea is the main concern. Like compared to this conference, since I've been here, I've never heard that word in like last 4 hours. No one actually talk about North Korea at the moment, but that is our main concern. So I'd like to ask, do you think the solving North Korean problem, is it more like regional actors should play important role, or more from like broad outside, like United Nations or other actors would play, or because it's likely that after the Kim Jong-il passed away, it might actually collapse by themselves. What is your like broad view on North Korea? I just wanted to ask.
Okay, so we have a very wide-ranging series of questions there, something for each member of the panel to, I think, choose from perhaps, and give us a view either on Indigenous people and government apologies, perhaps even international apologies, which was mentioned earlier too, reconciliation, situation in Nigeria and its wider implications, and situation with North Korea. So maybe I'll start with the President, if he would like to go first, and then I'll work my way back around the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think it's wonderful to hear talking about identity of the European Union. It's wonderful to listen about reconciliation. But I think that part of the subject this evening is talking about peace building in the world. I think that if we're going to talk about identity, we have to talk about the identity of the whole world. If we talk about identity in the European Union, it means that we are going to measure the rest of the world with that perspective, with that paradigm. So the rest of the world will be measured from that perspective. America will be measured according with the Western civilization. In Western civilization, Europe and the United States. But the rest of America is measured from that point of view, from that paradigm. And the rest of the world also is measured in that way. If we accept only the other culture, this otherness that Borges used to talk to, the otherness, and that otherness will be also from the perspective of one side. That's a very unilateral point of view. We are not talking about a multilateral point of view. We are not talking about multiculturalism. That I suggest that maybe we should talk about interculturalism, because Western civilization do not accept the other cultures as contribution to civilization. They are only other cultures, sometimes exotic or exogenous. We are not making a reconciliation since the beginning. We are not making up a peace building. So we need to start talking about interculturality from the whole world. We need some other identities to create that. And that certainly start to start from culture. They're not subcultures. We cannot say, well, European identity is to know very well Mozart or Beethoven. But if some indigenous in South America doesn't know about Mozart or Beethoven, it's not a culture. It's a different culture. And we accept it in that way. If we're not starting for that new paradigm, that what I'm saying is not all of it, but it's part of it. But we have to start from there, recognizing that we're talking about a globalization. That globalization cannot be built from one point of view. Europe or Western civilization needs to be really multicultural, accepted in the way they are. And I don't think we're doing that. I don't think the world is doing that. I don't think we're not doing that this evening, with all due respect. And I think that if we avoid to talk about disarmament, if we don't talk about disarmament, talking about peace would be an hypocrisy. We have to talk about disarmament now, and we have to do it with a loud voice. And I'm talking now about every culture in the world for a real new civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Galtung.
I would like to build on what the preceding speaker just said, President Palacio. Globalization. Why not globalize God? I have a book with that title lying out there. The point about it is the following. All religions have so much beauty to convey, but a lot of shit too. And it is totally permitted to select. I don't think anybody should feel condemned to pick up the paranoid, the psychopathological, together with the gems. Now, you can have hard readings, you can have soft readings of religions. And I could say, softies all over the world unite. You have the light, and have dialogues with your harder brothers and sisters. And the harder ones are found in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, also in Buddhism. Just look at the Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka, how they behaved. Look at some of the Thai Buddhism, how that one behaves. Look at Buddhism in Japan during militarism, how it was a part of kamikaze. Now, having said that, my identity is with the world. And I try to practice a French slogan, Je prends mon bien où je le trouve. I take what I need where I find it. And I just find the world immensely rich. Now, jumping from there to the problem of reconciliation. Would the European colonizing powers and the United States please be so kind and not walk out of conferences when this issue is brought up? The way they behaved in Durban was a shame to Western civilization. It was brought up in such a mild and soft form, one of the worst crimes in human history. Shoah is blueberries relative to Western colonialism. It's nothing, just a little needle prick in comparison. And they couldn't stand hearing it. Now, the same applies to Israel. I think it's a little bit blind to talk about Israel without mentioning Vladimir Jabotinsky, the key ideologue of Zionism. And any talk about an Israel-Palestinian colloquium where Zionism doesn't come up seems to me a little bit blind. They have an agenda which is very inimical to peace. That agenda will have to be dropped, and it will be dropped. There will be a new Israel coming up. They are now in a blind alley. Not only a former prime minister, the whole country is in coma, suffering from lack of intellectual activity, being autistic and being fed artificially. I'm willing to defend that statement, but I have also done something others haven't done here. I have presented a very concrete idea. Israel with the 5 neighboring countries in the Middle East community, the Israel of 1967. Obama, will you please not pay attention to the fact that you were launched by Jews for Obama in Chicago 2004, and that your major financial party was Goldman Sachs? Forget about that one. Try to be faithful to people. When it comes to, I'll jump Nigeria, but I will go to one which I'm very much a specialist on, North Korea. Your problem is not North Korea. Your problem is yourself and your alliance with the US. The conflict is not between North Korea and South Korea, it's between North Korea and US. US had an uninterrupted series of victories from they ended the War of Independence against that one in 1812 till they were beaten in the sense of obtaining only a stalemate with Korea in 1953. They hate North Korea. The road ahead is diplomatic relations, normalization, and a peace treaty. That's the one that corresponds to what I said about 1953 for Iran. In that belongs then a recognition from Japan of the crimes they have committed. Yes, North Korea has abducted some Japanese, that's true. But what was committed under the ideology of the empire, the Japanese emperor, the Hakko-ichio, collecting the 8 corners of the world under one roof, and Amaterasu Miyokami, the sun goddess, enormous. Now, the other side has also been problematic. And I can come and say something in defense of the Japanese government. They couldn't do the European community trick with a China run by Mao Zedong and South Korea run by Chiang Kai-shek, and afterwards of that Taiwan, and of course Syngman Rhee for the South Korea part, with the North Korea run by Kim Il-sung, and so on. But all that has now changed, with the exception of North Korea. The general East Asian approach to development is infrastructure and economic development first, including education and health, then opening up and civil political. I'm a little bit shocked by the young people here who haven't asked one question about misery and poverty. about the millions, billion of people suffering in the world. And the fact that China lifted 400 million from misery into lower middle class in a period of 14 years. I happen to know how they did it, the 5-pronged approach and the 3 things after that. If anybody has the curiosity of knowing how that happened, when I have a cup of coffee, approach me. I'll not fatigue the audience with that, because I assume that the approach to China is different, is to find the negative points about China, and they exist. And I can tell you a couple you don't know about. Also available for a cup of coffee. Now, just to finish it, the point is this. The future of Japan and reconciliation is an East Asian community. That East Asian community would be a marvel based on Confucianism and Buddhism. Confucianism for growth, Buddhism for wisdom. And illuminated by the Chinese-Japanese joint vision of social and world harmony. There will be elements of democracy, human rights in the Western sense, democracy in the Western sense, and there will be other things. So welcome to the world.
Okay, Professor Brauch, want to say anything? No.
I understand the attractiveness of what we heard, and I certainly do agree with many things. I would rather not use that example of a sick man still alive with the state, but that is one of the differences that there is between us. But I do think that many things that you said are not only intellectually attractive, but really very, very good. I think that when it comes to reconciliation, there is one difference that some of our, not only, it's a too complex term that we have. If we speak, for me, reconciliation is not the act and it is not the fact. It is the process. And if we approach it from a social point of view, or state point of view, or nation point of view, it is always question where and when that process starts. We can go back to before Jesus Christ and find reasons to start with reconciliation there. If we come from individual, and maybe for me it is a little bit easier because, as I said earlier, I'm a psychologist by my training. Intellectually, reconciliation starts in the moment when I think that I can live in peace with somebody. But that is cognitive category, intellectual category. And that is just the beginning of the process. That process at the individual level is, I cannot even say finish, reach certain level when I emotionally accept the fact to live in a peace with that other. And that is very complex and very complicated process on one individual. When we have it on a group, it becomes even more and more complicated. What I personally think, I do think that international community can help in that process. I, for example, do think that the example of European Union is an excellent example. Whatever we take concretely, not coal and steel, not, but something that makes people to think, to have a common vision. Because among the things that we can certainly isolate and to say this is something that will help to the process of reconciliation, common vision is probably at the top. There are a number of things. Earlier was mentioned, actually, question was what is with apology. I'll tell you, frankly, and when we look even in modern history, apology in theory should help always. In reality, apology sometimes helps, sometimes does not. It depends how it is phrased, how it is received, how it is accepted. Let me mention the very recent example so we cannot still judge it too much. There was apology of the president of Serbia in the Croatia together with the president of Croatia in the city of Vukovar a couple days ago. I personally think that that was absolutely great thing. And I am personally convinced that that will help to reconciliation. By the way, that process is going anyway, which it was, despite of all difficulties, a little bit easier in Europe and problems are a little bit less. So, what I'm arguing and what I'm trying to say reconciliation, it's philosophically, psychologically, sociologically nice term, and we can speculate all night about that. And there is always something that you will all agree, yes, there is something in that. How to move from that to some concrete action? It is naive to think that it can be changed overnight. But also I was very careful student of United Nations systems and working in both sides of the angle. I do not find any concrete plans, and not to mention concrete action into direction of helping people or helping groups to come to the reconciliation. I do think that it is possible to find something which will not produce results tomorrow, but on the long term and the long run, it will give us some results.
Thank you very much. And last, but certainly not least,
why not
Professor Giddens.
Well, having not any lunch, I'm looking forward to my dinner, I must say. Anyway, I'd like to thank the audience for, very diverse, interesting questions and observations. I think, really good session, I must say. I mean, I'd quite like to comment on Korea because, insofar as I understood what Johan said, I didn't fully agree with that. Because, first of all, I think North Korea was there in the discussion. It was there latently because Iran uses North Korea as part of its reasoning because it says, look, once you've got nuclear weapons, then no one dares attack you, no matter more or less, who you are. And so I think the North Korean example has been quite important. But I think that, South Korea's relationship with the US has actually been pretty tortuous and complex. I mean, I got very friendly with Kim Dae-jung when he was in Cambridge. And interestingly, because this brings it back right to the very beginning, he came to Cambridge to study what happened in the relationship between West and East Germany after the fall of the wall as a model for what might happen in Korea if there was a reunification process. But I mean, I don't think it was just a question of closeness to America because the CIA buddy would try to assassinate him, if you remember, and he only very narrowly escaped when they had assassination plot against him. I mean, I was quite an admirer of Kim Dae-jung, and it was a shame that he ended his life a bit mired in corruption. He was a genuine Democrat, he wrote his prison notebooks. He was, a fighter, I think, and by and large, I think he was right to pursue a sunshine policy. And, I think that is the most appropriate. It is a kind of version of reconciliation, if you like. And since he was off the scene, I think the relationship between the two Koreas has actually been more tortuous. And I think it's still a flashpoint there, really. And I think the world ignores the relationship between the two parts of Korea at its peril, and therefore we have to keep that on our radar as well as Iran, because you've got two countries confronting one another there, and North Korea is so far behind that I don't think you could ever it was enough trouble reuniting East Germany with West Germany, but you couldn't have something similar. So very serious issue, even if you've got a process of reunification, but we shouldn't ignore Korea. I completely agree with the tenor of your question.
Thank you very much. Can I thank everybody for their questions and for their persistence, staying a little bit later, and ask you to join me in thanking the panel. But first, just to say that I hope you have enjoyed today. I hope that tomorrow we can take all of these discussions further. I'll certainly return to one of the points that was made in my talk tomorrow afternoon, and I hope you look forward to a good social occasion tonight. A bright early start tomorrow morning, and more fruitful discussion over the next 3 or 4 days. Can I ask you to join with me in thanking tonight's panel for their contributions, not just tonight, but during the course of the day today. Thank you very much to all 5 of the speakers.